Alright, I'm in Hobby Lobby today because I needed to pick up more yarn for a project, and I decided to do something maybe crazy. I brought in the calipers. So over the summer, I filmed a video where I measured all my crochet hooks, and a lot of y'all thought that was really interesting, and I wanted to kind of expand my data set. So while I'm here at Hobby Lobby, I'm gonna go through and measure a bunch of these different hooks. I guess I'll be sticking with the Yarnology brand, which is kind of what Hobby Lobby carries, and we'll see how Hobby Lobby holds up on the accuracy of their hook sizes. All right, 15 millimeter. That's pretty good. Let's try another random 15 millimeter. Oh, that one's awesome. Let's check some of these out because these ones were a little iffy last time. So this is a 3 millimeter hook. All right, awesome. All right, and a 5 millimeter. I feel like 5 millimeters on most brands tend to do pretty well. Not bad. All right, I'm gonna measure some more hooks, compile data, and we'll see where we end up. All right, so I'm back home. It's a few days later, and I just finished filling out all my data into the spreadsheet, so I'm gonna talk you through this. However, I'm gonna go through this on the assumption you watched my previous video about measuring hook sizes. That's going to give a far more thorough breakdown of what I'm looking at with the data and my logical rationale behind it. We'll touch on it briefly, but not as in much depth. So let's start really high level. When we were at the store, we measured 20 crochet hooks. I simultaneously feel like I measured a lot more, and I also simultaneously feel like 20 is a lot more than we measured. My mom was filming for me. I appreciate her so much. Thank you, Mom. And I didn't want to have her stuck in the Hobby Lobby for too long. I was feeling pretty run down that day. But I feel like 20 hooks is a decent sampling of Hobby Lobby hooks, just broadly speaking. I have divided the hooks up into 4 categories. The first I am calling basic plastic, which these are just basic plastic hooks. To be completely honest, they look kind of cheap and cheesy, but they're pretty affordable. I only ended up measuring 3 of those now that I'm looking at my data here. The next group I am calling chunky plastic hooks. I measured 6 of those, and these are those ones that they're chunky plastic, and they have the ergonomic handles that are kind of like tie-dye swirled. Marbled looking. The next other hooks that I measured were these rounded hooks, is what I'm calling them. The handle's very bulbous, kind of rounded, kind of like the shape of a furls crochet hook, if you're familiar with those. I only ended up measuring 4 of those. And in the last category, I am calling toothbrush. This is what those hooks look like, and the reason I call them toothbrush hooks is because I had a friend who got one of these hooks and she told me that they reminded her of toothbrushes, and once she said that, I'm like, they absolutely do, so now I think of those as the toothbrush hooks. And with those, I measured 7 of them. All right, so if you look at the 3 basic plastic ones, the smallest one I measured was 4.5, the biggest was 10, and these are pretty great. The accuracy was really phenomenal on these. And when we look at the quantitative difference, so just like the measured difference, they're very small, less than 0.2 for all of them. Then this section that I'm calling percent difference, this is a comparison of how relatively off is the hook size. So it's comparing the measured size to the listed size on the hook to see how accurate it is. Everything is within 2% accuracy. I feel like that's pretty good. And quite honestly, for them being kind of cheesier looking hooks, I've never tried them. They just, being honest, they look like plastic, cheap, cheesy hooks. I think the accuracy is really awesome. So if you're a beginner and you're trying to get into crochet on a budget, I think this would be a great option because you're still gonna have the quality of hook size accuracy, and maybe they actually work up great. I've never used them, like I said. The next category of hooks is those chunky plastic ones. I actually do have one of these, and the one that I owned was very accurate. I was very happy about that when I measured that in my past video. This one is when I first started measuring, so I was a little more intentional in my sampling, and then I got to the point where I'm like, just grabbing hooks, randomly measuring stuff. But what I did with this category is I measured 4 different sizes. The smallest was 5.5 millimeters, biggest was 15 millimeters. But within this category, I measured 2 15 millimeter hooks and 2 8 millimeter hooks. And the reason I did that was because the first 15 millimeter hook was really accurate, but I wanted to see, is that just a fluke or are all of them accurate? And so if we look at those 2 15 millimeter hooks, the accuracy on both of them is pretty good. They're both within 2.5 millimeters of their advertised size. And again, the percent difference that they're off by is less than 2%. Again, I feel like that's pretty good. They don't measure exactly the same as each other, but I think it's a reasonable difference. Similar results when I compared the two 8mm crochet hooks that I measured. One measured 8.08 millimeters and one measured 8.14 millimeters. Again, both within that 2.5 millimeters of accuracy and both less than 2% off. And really, these chunky plastic ones overall performed really well. Moving down to my rounded hooks. Again, I only have 3 of these here, so very small sampling. Looking at their quantitative differences, I feel like they did all right. They weren't the most accurate compared to other ones that I measured, but they were not by any means that terrible. They were all within 1/4 millimeter of accuracy, which I think is really important because if you're off by more than 1/4 millimeter, you've kind of crossed into the territory of a completely different hook size. So I feel like they're at least in their range of what size they're supposed to be. But we did see some higher percent differences here. We had one that was off by 3.75%, and if you'll notice, that is on a smaller size hook. I definitely found when I did this with all my hooks and going through this as well, that the smaller the hook is, the less likely it was to be accurate or the more inaccuracy there was with it. Which kind of makes sense because if you're doing something on a really small scale, a seemingly small amount could actually be a really big part of the total amount and make a bigger impact than you might expect. Also, I see now that I said I had 3 rounded hooks, I actually had 4 of them. And yeah, if we look at all 4 of them, we have another one that's over 3% off. So, and that one also was not within 0.25 millimeters of accuracy. So I take back what I said earlier. This last one definitely brought the category down a little bit. So then my last category, I have the 7 toothbrush hooks. These performed all right, except for when we got really small, which again, I kind of figured as much. If we look at just the first 5, these hooks range from 3 millimeters on up to 6 millimeters. And the 3 millimeter honestly did pretty great. It was only off by 1%, which I think is totally negligible. So kudos to the 3 millimeter toothbrush hook that I measured. If we look at the quantitative differences, the most that any of them were off by is 0.07 millimeters, so pretty negligible. And then if we look at the percent difference, everything looks really great there. Everything is less than 1.5% off. I feel like that's really solid. But then when we look at these last 2 here, the 1.5 millimeter and the 2.5 millimeter hook, this is where things get dicey. The 2.5 millimeter hook, yeah, that one just totally nosedived all the data. And that one was off by 18.4%. In my opinion, that's unacceptable. If we look at whether or not it was within 0.25 millimeters of accuracy, no, it was not. It was off by 0.46 millimeters, which basically means that this 2.5 millimeter hook is really a 3 millimeter hook for all practical applications. The 1.5% hook performed just a little bit better, but still, that one was off by 13%. Which I don't love, even though it was within 0.25 millimeters of accuracy. It just, yeah, it was a little disappointing. So I think those small hooks in the toothbrush style, it's kind of just, you're gonna get what you get. If it were me going forward and I needed to buy another 1.5 millimeter hook, I would absolutely bring the calipers into the store with me again. Just so that way I can find the one on the rack that is the most accurate for my needs. So if we come over here, we can look at the different styles kind of in aggregate. The first 2 plastic ones performed phenomenally. All of those hooks were within the level of acceptance within that 0.25 millimeters of accuracy. A little over 1% inaccurate, which I think is totally fine. It's not going to make a difference for me personally. Then for the rounded hooks, these ones definitely got dragged down by that, by the 10 millimeter crochet hook. So the other 3 were all right, but the 10 millimeter crochet hook, the amount it was off definitely brought things down. Granted, I only had a sample size of 4 hooks, so take that as you will. But then lastly, the toothbrush hooks, those are over 5% off, and that's the point where I start being like, these hooks aren't quite so accurate. Again, those last 2 hooks, the smaller sizes, skewed things. So I'm gonna really quick take out that data just to see how the larger hook sizes performed. Just a second. Formulas, if I can figure this out on the fly. Well, I'm gonna go down to 22. So if we get rid of those 2 really small hooks, it actually makes the toothbrush category the best category, and it brings it down to within 1% accuracy, which is really great. However, I don't think it's fair to just totally just ditch the bad hooks because, you know, we could make all hooks look great if we just didn't look at the bad hooks. So there's one last thing I want to talk about with this data that I collected and kind of my analysis that I think is important to keep in mind here. And we've kind of already hit on sample size, very small sample size. But if we look at them based on the different hook styles, it looks like the toothbrush hooks are like the real bad ones and everything else is more accurate. However, what I think is important to take into consideration here is the smallest hook size in any of my categories, they were all within the toothbrush subset. So with the rounded hooks, I only went down to a measuring of 4mm. The smallest chunky hook I measured was 5.5. And the smallest basic hook I measured was 4.5. So if we look at the toothbrush hooks, we've got a 3.5, we've got a 3mm, a 2.5, and a 1.5mm. So much smaller than the other categories. So there is the potential that the smaller hooks in the other categories could also bring the metrics on those categories down by a lot. I don't have measurements of smaller ones in those sizes, however, because I don't think any of them actually went down to like a 3.5. I'll pull up on Hobby Lobby's website and see, because the toothbrush ones went down small. The big chunky plastic ones, yeah, I think like a 5mm, 5.5 was the smallest those ones went. The rounded ones, I think they did have some smaller rounded ones. I should have measured one that was in like the 3mm range to see. The basic plastic ones, again, I don't know how small those ones went. So that's important to keep in mind with this analysis as well, that had I measured more smaller hooks in the other categories might have underperformed compared to how they're appearing right now. All in all though, I think Hobby Lobby hooks held up pretty well. These are not by any means a never buy it again because they're inaccurate, but with some of these, especially the smaller hook size, yeah, I'll be bringing my calipers into the store. But since their hooks tend to not be terribly expensive, it is nice to know that you can get some decent ergonomic hooks on a smaller budget. I don't know about y'all, but I had a lot of fun digging into the data on hook sizes again. If you guys enjoyed this, I can try to go to my Michaels store and measure hooks there. I don't really know what styles of hooks they carry, and I guess I'd have to check and make sure that they're not in packaging, that like I can measure them. If you know if Michaels stocks hooks that I can measure because they're not in packaging, please let me know. And if you guys are interested in that, let me know. I feel like I'm saying let me know 100 times here. Anyways, I just have a Hobby Lobby and a Michaels as stores in my area that I can measure because Joanne is no more. But anyways, I'm kind of curious to see how the hooks that Michaels sells holds up. So whether you guys are interested or not, I might still make a video on it anyways. If you haven't watched my video where I did a really big analysis on all the hooks I own, be sure to go check it out. It's some really interesting stuff there. And you might get some insight onto what hooks are better to buy than others. Thank you so much for joining me and happy crafting.